Good evening, everyone. Good evening, colleagues. Good evening, friends. On behalf of the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy, I want to warmly welcome you to tonight's event on permission, pleasure, power, and consent as the foundation for disability and reproductive justice. My name is Monica Mitra. I direct the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy here at the Heller School at Brandeis. I'm also the Nancy Lurie Marks Professor of Disability Policy. And it is my honor and delight to welcome all of you here who are in person, as well as those who are online, to our third Carrie Buck Distinguished Fellowship Lecture. So this fellowship was launched in 2023. And our inaugural distinguished fellow was Lori Bertram Roberts, followed by our 2024 fellow, who's right here, Robin Wilson Beatty. And tonight, we are thrilled, we are delighted to honor and host the incredible Laura Miller. Tonight, we're going to, our event will feature a conversation between Laura and Rebecca Coakley, who does not need an introduction. She is a prominent disability rights activist and the program officer of the Ford Foundation's first ever US Disability Rights Fund. And we're deeply grateful to the Ford Foundation's support of this fellowship and to our amazing advisory board. Robin Wilson Beatty, Heather Watkins, Colleen Flanagan, Morenike Giwa-Onaibu, Aisha Elaine Lewis, and Renee Bracy Sherman. And some of you are here today, and thank you. And thank you for your careful guidance in selecting this year's remarkable Carrie Buck Fellow. And I would not do justice if I didn't recognize the stellar, the wonderful Lurie team. Particularly Wendy Peveril-Conti, who's right there. Amy Abushanab, who's up there on her laptop. Nicole Lomerson on the second row there. And Maddie Crowley, our communications extraordinaire. And this event would not be possible without them. So I'm sure many of you are wondering, like, how and why we launched a fellowship named after Carrie Buck. And I'm going to leave the why to Laura and Rebecca, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the how. So a few years ago, really at the height of the COVID pandemic, we honored Rebecca Coakley, who had been awarded at Brandeis University the Richmond Distinguished Fellowship. And at the end of the fellowship, during this Q&A, she was asked by a Brandeis student, given that Justice Louis Brandeis sided with the Supreme Court majority in upholding Buck v. Bell, can you comment on what the university can or should do to acknowledge this and commit to disability justice? Great question, and Rebecca's response was swift and forceful, as it always is. And she suggested that Brandeis host a lecture that would start a conversation about Buck v. Bell, and to quote Rebecca, focused on the radicalness of the idea of disabled people being parents and having the right to parent. So this casual suggestion, impromptu suggestion of Rebecca's led to the creation of this important fellowship, which honors Carrie Buck and recognizes the lasting consequences of the Buck v. Bell decision. And as a university and as the Lurie Institute, we are committed to addressing this history, mitigating its impact, and celebrating the work of people like Laura Miller. And so before I pass the program to my colleague, Sarah Shostak, who's the Dean of the School of Social Policy and Social Science, Social Science and Social Policy, I want to share the words of the late Patty Byrne, co-founder of Since Invalid and pivotal co-creator of the Disability Justice Framework, who sadly passed away earlier this year. There has always been resistance to all forms of oppression. As we know through our bones, there have simultaneously been disabled people visioning a world where we flourish a world that values and celebrates us in all our myriad beauty. So it is in that spirit that we gather tonight to celebrate and honor the work of building a just world. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone. As Monica mentioned, my name is Sarah Shostak. I'm the Dean of the New School of Social Sciences and Social Policy here at Brandeis, where one of my extraordinary honors is to work with Monica and her team at the Lurie Institute, which is widely recognized as a gem at Brandeis, as well as a national leader and a group that we are just extraordinarily proud to have as a part of our intellectual community. Tonight, I have the privilege of introducing our two incredible speakers. First, I'd like to introduce our sensational Carrie Buck Distinguished Fellow, Laura Miller. She is a leading sexual health educator, researcher, and consultant with a focus on the blind community. As a blind queer mother navigating multiple disabilities and chronic illnesses, her personal experiences enrich and shape her professional expertise, influencing both her coaching and consultancy work. She is a passionate advocate for comprehensive and inclusive sexual health information and services for everyone, especially people with a variety of disabilities. In more recent years, her dedication has evolved to ensuring that sex education is not only comprehensive and inclusive, but accessible to all. This dedication stems from a blend of personal, academic, and professional experiences. Overall, the foundation of her work is about the promotion of consent, which is intertwined with blind positivity, sex positivity, and the principles of disability justice. Welcome. Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Coakley, though you've already heard that Rebecca needs no introduction. She is the program officer for the Ford Foundation's first ever disability rights program, which is focused on strengthening the field, building a pipeline of diverse leadership, promoting disability pride, and mobilizing resources towards disability rights work. She also serves as the foundation's liaison to the President's Council for Disability Inclusion and Philanthropy. She was awarded, as you heard, Brandeis University's Richmond Distinguished Fellowship. She has stewarded a campaign that has resulted in unprecedented 12 presidential candidates and hopefully more, developing disability policy platforms. She's a 3-time presidential appointee, and she has served in key policy roles at the Department of Education and in the Department of Health and Services. We are so happy to have you both here with us tonight and eager to learn from your expertise, insights, and wisdom. We should clap again. As Monica mentioned, 3 years ago, we began to imagine a conversation on the legacy of Buck v. Bell, its connection to Brandeis, and how we could change that legacy. Tonight, we continue this conversation between Laura and Rebecca, two disabled women, parents, and advocates in the fight for disability rights and justice. Tonight is a special opportunity for all of us to gather in person and online, where I'm watching the numbers going up and up, to remember our past, to push forth a new world where we all belong, thrive, and are celebrated. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Coakley. It is my pleasure to be here with all of you tonight. I have shoulder-length red and ongoing graying hair, thanks to my 3 children. And the time and space that we are in at this moment, I'm wearing a dress that is black on the top and plaid on the bottom and black shoes. I have achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. No, I don't know Peter Dinklage, but I can tell you stories about him. And it is my pleasure to be here with all of you and to open us up Laura, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I also want you to start with talking to us about what does this award mean to you and why does the legacy of Carrie Buck matter?
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to start with 18 years ago. My son is almost 18. I found out I was going to be a mom, and I knew I was going to be a single mom from the beginning. I was already blind. I had been blind for a few years, but I didn't have community. I didn't have any networks. I didn't know how blind people did this. And truthfully, I wasn't really interested still. But I had heard the horror stories, and I was worried about CPS being called or whether I would be able to take my child home from the hospital. And so I have parents in the medical field, and they advised me to start interviewing the doctors and doing some of those preemptive conversations to make sure that I was being seen as a whole person. I didn't have that language. I didn't know that that's what I was trying to do, but very much interviewed those doctors and the care team that eventually helped me deliver my son. For about 9 years, I didn't know that I had an entire community out there, disabled and blind people who had the same fears and facing custody battles and children being taken away. I very much didn't understand what was happening. I was doing cancer and diabetes research at the time, and so just very independent. Decided to get my degree in sexuality, and that is when I merged with the blind community and started to see just how pervasive this was and what a problem it was. And even today, there are parents who are trying to fight for custody, and the only issue is that they are blind. No other problems. And so when I think of parenting and the joys that people think of when they want to bring a child into this world, I'm not sure that it should be met with, is this doctor going to report me? Am I going to be able to send my child home with me just because I asked how to change a diaper? Lots of new parents need a nurse to help them show them how to change a diaper for the first time, but this is the reality for many blind folks. And so I started doing this work, and I had no idea how important this history was. The history of Carrie Buck, the history of eugenics, the history in my field of reproductive health and sexuality. I didn't know all of the harm that had been done to Black and brown women. I didn't know that we were operating on them, learning. They just didn't teach me this in school. And so I really, if you know your history, you can start to see it in the present day. And so we may not call it eugenics the same, and we may think that that was something from the Holocaust and it didn't happen here, but it did happen here, and it is still happening here. So Carrie Buck, I just love that you all have created this fellowship to honor her name and to bring awareness to this, and so that we can keep having these conversations.
That piece about medicalized trauma is so real, and not knowing that it's a thing. I remember when, I grew up in the dwarfism community, both my parents have dwarfism. And I remember literally sending the email to my office that I had gone into labor and I was not going to be able to speak on a panel with Valerie Jarrett and a bunch of White House officials later that day. And my husband sending an email to his office. And at the time, my husband worked the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor. And 30 seconds after he sends his email, and this is at 5:30 in the morning, my phone rings, and it's one of his coworkers, a woman named Jennifer Kemp. And I answered the phone because Jen was also a neighbor. And I'm like, I wonder why Jen's calling me at 5:30 in the morning. And I was like, hey, this is Rebecca. And she said, before you have this baby, know that you can fire anybody on your care team at any point in time. And I was like, what? And she goes, and Jen has cerebral palsy. And Jen was like, nobody told me that if a doctor is bad to me, a nurse is bad to me, I get treated bad, I can fire anyone on my care team. And she was like, and I literally just saw Patrick's email saying that y'all are having this baby now. And know that you can fire any of those people. Okay? Good luck. Send us baby pictures. Goodbye. Hung up the phone. And I remember my husband being like, what was that about? I was like, Jen Kemp just called to tell us that we can fire anybody we don't like. And he was like, huh, okay, that's interesting. And my first delivery was really easy. And my second was a nightmare. And I had to, fire the anesthesiologist and all of these things. And I think about what position I would have been in had I not known that I could do that.
Mhm.
And I think it really does come down to the conversation around consent in disability spaces. And I think one of the things, and you and I talked about this earlier today, that we often don't talk about is that as disabled people, we are explicitly trained from the time that we acquire our disability, whether it be at birth, whether it be in your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, your 60s, that the focus should be on compliance,
Mhm.
not consent. That let the nurses or the professionals examine you. Give up your sense of bodily autonomy to make the job easy for the medical professional or for your teacher. Don't push back on your physical therapist or your OT because they actually know better than you
Mhm.
what you're capable of. And I think this does a lot of harm to disabled people, and that the idea of consent shouldn't be a radical one. But why do you think that is?
Why consent is so radical?
Yeah.
I think because people just think they hear consent and they think sex and they think sexuality in the bedroom. And that's a conversation that happens behind closed doors and between consenting adults. And they don't realize how it's in every interaction. You are either upholding somebody's autonomy or you're taking it away if you're interacting with somebody. And so if we don't start having the consent in everyday conversations, if we don't let our children know from a very, very young age that they have the right to say no, um, it gets so much harder as they go. Why is it so radical? We're also not used to giving children power. Childism is very real in our society. I have a favorite quote about it, but I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head. But it's basically every hierarchy of power starts with analogy of childism, this rule of adults over children. But I feel like if we give children the consent language, we can equip them for better relationships for their entire life. And I will give just one example. I am a mother. He's now 18. He also curates my stories very carefully. So if I tell any stories about him, it has been approved. He was in 4th grade and kept stepping out of line. And the chaperone kept pushing him back into line. And he kept saying, don't touch me, rather assertively. And the chaperone said to him, say, please don't touch me. And my son turned around and said, I shouldn't have to say, please, you shouldn't be touching me. At that point, the chaperones told him to stop sassing and that he was going to talk to his mother about it. And so the first thing my kid does is come home and make sure that he wasn't in the wrong and that he was, asserting himself. I don't think they're too young. I don't think there's an age where something like that isn't appropriate.
Talking about how actually, and this wasn't a question I was going to originally ask you, but the comment that you just made about your son approving the stories that you tell about him. Years ago, I had been asked to write a piece on disability and Mother's Day and to tell a story about my son. And we were in the car, and I remember we were driving home from work. I had picked him up from daycare or from school. He was in elementary school at the time. And I remember saying to him, so, Jackson, I was asked to write a piece about being a mom with a disability, and I wanted to tell them this story. And he had had a really rough year, and there was some issues around consent, and there was some issues around neglect at the school that he was at the time. And I said, I want to tell this story. And he was like, you're not telling that story. And I was like, what? And he goes, you're not telling that story. I don't want you to tell that story. And I was like, okay. And so instead, I wrote the piece about not telling the story. I was like, I'm going to write this story about not telling you the story about what happened. Because I remember as a kid, my parents signed on for one of my surgeries to be shown on CNN. And they happened to show it on December 4th, which was my birthday. And the day that we had my birthday party at my house with all my friends.
Wow.
Yeah, and back then this is how old I am. You couldn't record stuff in advance. There was no like DVR didn't exist. We had these things called VCRs. And this was pre-timers for VCRs. So you would have to real time record what you wanted to record. You had to have the television on even. This is like 1982, 83. And so there at my birthday party in all its shining glory was my like straightening of my legs. And I remember being so mad at my parents. And then as a parent reflecting back and being like, no, he has the perfect, like absolute right to say no to that.
Mhm.
And so, thinking about transition age thinking about young people across the spectrum, starting at childhood all the way through adolescence, how do we start the conversation? How do we plant the seeds to be, in the words of Harriet McBride Johnson, feisty and non-compliant?
Plant seeds around.
Being able to say no.
Yeah. I often say, I'm sorry, that this is a cradle to grave conversation. And when I am talking to parents of blind children and we're having the consent conversation with babies, you'll often get sort of looked at like, that's a baby. I'm not having a consent conversation with a baby. But we break it down a little bit more. And I like to show a clip from the show This Is Us, where there's a blind infant on the show. And the uncle makes a comment and says, how come the baby doesn't like me? He's always crying when I pick him up. And the mom explains, it's not that the baby doesn't like you, it's the baby needs more information. The baby needs to know you're there, so talk to it, coo to it, tell them you're there, rub the cheek, let him know you're gonna pick him up, and then try picking up the baby. And so again, people think consent is the thing that happens in the bedroom that makes the babies, but yet we're at the other end of the conversation where you're gauging those cues, you're talking, and it just grows from there. And so with our youth, a lot of the teachers, we have to have these same conversations about building consent cultures and helping them realize that the messages and the seeds they plant today will turn into the relationships of tomorrow. And so if you are always doing the thing for your child in the class, or not holding them to high expectations, or you don't think that they're going to be in a relationship, you're going to pass that along. And so really having them check their biases. You were asking about transitional age adults, and I went to the teachers.
That totally, I mean, teachers, I think, have such a tremendous impact on young people at that age, and being able to create the space for those conversations to be had, I think is really critical. You also talked about like the blind community and connecting with the community. And I think this conversation around consent and sex and sexuality continues to play out within each, the reason I use the term disco for disability community is because A, it was way shorter on Twitter, but B, like our community, there's the big umbrella, and then there's like each subdivision, and even within like the divisions, there's subdivisions of the subdivisions, within, by diagnosis type, by culture, by values, etc. And I think we have really internalized like sexual ableism within our communities that plays out in different ways. Like, how do you see that conversation when it comes to talking about sex, sexuality within the blindness community?
So I think what's really interesting is I thought, and I really am there to have a conversation around sexuality, but it really tends to start unpacking more around the ableism conversation, more around the beliefs around blindness, especially when talking about the transitional age adults. Will I be a parent? Will I be able to do these things? That's where we really start to get into the more permission conversations with our community. Sorry, I went back to the transitional age adults. I forgot your question.
Like how do these conversations play out within, like, I know the conversations that we intentionally choose to have or not to have within the dwarfism community, what does that look like within the blindness community?
Around consent.
Around consent.
Yeah. So I think the biggest conversation I have, whether it's with youth, transitional age youth, my friends, my colleagues, is the microaggressions, the constantly being touched or assisted without permission or consent. And so really starting to like look at the impact of that, and the research that shows that it causes chronic stress, and what do we do with that? And so going back to the earlier part of your conversation, we're often told to be nice or be compliant or educate. As an educator, I am told to educate. I cannot educate everybody who does a microaggression every single day. And so a lot of the conversations I'm having with the youth and my colleagues are how to have a more empowered response. This thing is going to happen. We have all of our own traumas and histories we're bringing into the situation. So for myself, I was fawning, I was going along with unwanted help. And I didn't like that. I wanted a more empowered response. Other colleagues might be fighting and not like that and want a more empowered response. But the more empowered response is something they get to choose. And so whether it's saying, thank you, I've got this, or whether it's saying F off, I give the whole permission for that conversation.
Well, I think also as a as a parent, also, I find myself, I was actually at a disability conference focused on rural issues a few weeks ago. And you know that feeling when like you're like, oh, this situation's getting kind of weird and the hair starts standing up on the back of your neck. I was sitting in the bar with my dear friend Maria Town, and I like to say my weirdo radar went off as a disabled person, where I'm like, oh, there's somebody over there. Oh gosh, here it comes. And as it comes over, it's like, I've never seen a little lady like you before. And I was just like, oh, here it comes. And you find yourself, or at least I know I find myself pausing and thinking about, okay, like, what are the different ways that I choose to respond to it in this moment? Like, do I choose to get really loud because I'm in a public setting in a bar? There are a bunch of disabled people here. This guy is not with our conference. At least I don't think he's with our conference. He could be with our conference. Is it safe for me to respond? Which I think a lot of times as disabled women, like that question comes up, like, is it like physically safe for me to respond? And what can disability organizations, what can our leadership of our organizations do differently to create a culture where we can have this conversation?
First of all, I think that the culture of consent does not just start and stop with codes of conduct. I think that we see that a lot.
Yeah.
And then a lot of disability organizations, I've said this a couple of times today, but they're very good at making sure people might learn their independent living or can be independent or can become employable and be tax-paying members of society. But we don't leave as much room for the interpersonal,
For not being an asshole.
for the relationships, for this, for the conversations where I think we really do get to learn from each other. And so as much as I appreciate and have learned a lot from many of those organizations, it's still more of a custodial, if you do this, you can be independent, you can be employed, but that's not what we're all here for. We're all here for a much richer life, and there's the
And we shouldn't have to
pleasure word that's in there, and so just some examples, like when I'm working with the transitional age youth and their mobility instructor who's teaching them how to use the cane has a lot of power over where they can and can't go.
Ooh.
And so now they're 18, 19, 20, they're adults, but they're part of these programs, and they no longer have permission to go to the Starbucks because they don't have that skill yet. And I'm trying to teach and educate the teachers. We have something, the dignity of risk. You're allowed to make mistakes. You're allowed to learn from your lessons. And for me, the most motivating thing to get a 19-year-old to use their cane to go across to Starbucks is the date at Starbucks. And so let's stop gatekeeping them. And this is the youth echo this, that there's a real custodial, we're going to teach you to be independent, but you're going to do it our way.
I'm reminded of several years ago, I was at a conference in Dallas with a bunch of, back when I was a young disabled leader, I was probably in my early 20s. And there was a young woman in our group who was blind and who said very disappointedly that she had never been to a strip club. And my dear colleague, Christina Mills, and she'll kill me that I'm telling this story. Sorry, Chris. Chris and I were like, you've never been to a strip club? She said, no. We're like, do you want to go to a strip club? She's like, I think I would. And so first we had to get a cab, and the cab refused us service because at the time there was a massive lawsuit against Yellow Cab for denying service to people with service animals. And then we finally got on our way to go to La Bear, which was Dallas's #1 strip review. And I remember us like audio narrating it the whole way and like getting to the club, and it was, and the individual who we took, whose name I will allow to remain anonymous, is like high up in the leadership of a space encountering federal agency. And it was one of those moments where she was like, I've asked to go to a strip club numerous times and nobody ever, I was told that that wasn't appropriate and that those places weren't for people like me. And we're like, that's the first thing that tells us we need to take you to a strip club. Someone told you you can't go? And I think for a lot of us, pleasure in its various forms is gatekept from disabled people. And how should we as a community, and I think one of the things that's been so great about this lecture series every year is pleasure has come up as a piece of every conversation. I know Robin and I talked about it last year, Lori and I talked about it the year before. Why do we gatekeep pleasure?
I believe fear and ignorance. I'm sure there's lots of other reasons, but one of the innovative programs I was doing while at a blindness agency downtown San Francisco was workshops on everything from condoms to kink and everything in between. And the kink portion of that proved to be rather controversial, except it was all blind adults coming to a fully informed workshop ran by mental health therapists in the kink field. And it was such an incredible opportunity for so many to sort of learn in a blindness agency about this community. And then we had activities where we would go out into the community. That program was quickly shut down. And it was quickly shut down with terms like, I was exposing dependent adults to sexual violence. Everybody who came to either chose to go, maybe it was to Folsom Street Fair or to
I miss Folsom Street Fair.
yes, we had sighted guides at the Folsom Street Fair. People think kink and their minds go wild, but there was a woman there who used to be into fashion and designing, and she said to her human guide, I don't care what they're doing, tell me what they're wearing. Like the things that people go to sexuality for, I could have never imagined. And so one of the books I hope to write is to interview all of the people who were involved in that and see where they are now, because they are all living far more empowered and exciting lives than they were 10 years ago. So, but yes, it is gatekept. Yeah, I told the therapist we respectfully had to disagree. Our fields had very different opinions about consent, and we are independent adults.
It reminds me of several years ago, there was a pushback for any sexual education programming to be focused on only on abstinence.
Mhm.
And at the time, I was running a project that was funded with dollars from an agency focused on people with developmental disabilities, and it was a youth-led leadership development program. And the young people wanted to talk about sex, sexuality, and healthy relationships. And I remember getting a letter at the time from the federal agency that dispersed the dollars. That was in the middle of an administration change, and said, you know, you can only talk about happy friendships with disabled people.
Wow.
And I was like, happy friendships? Like, but some disabled people are jerks. What if they don't want to be are we gonna talk like happy friendships? Like what kind of paternalistic, ableist, like neurotypical, like conservative, like not helpful, like mess is this? And so I remember I was in my younger and saucier days, like writing back and like giving the data and saying, you know, we know that 80% of young women with developmental and intellectual disabilities are sexually abused or assaulted before the age of 18. We know that girls with learning disabilities have the highest rate of teen pregnancy. And like, you're telling us that we can't talk about the things, and it's a youth-led project by design. Language was in the RFP that it was youth-led. And they're like, well, we don't want those people learning too much. You know, and I think it's one of those things, especially when the rules of engagement are determined, frankly, by non-disabled people. There is we have to keep those people safe and uninformed. And, you know, and it really is like, like it puts all of our people, whether they be children or adults, at an increased level of risk.
Oh, for sure.
An increased level of vulnerability.
Mhm.
You know, what would, if we were to transform the sex education curriculum? If I gave you like a bippity boppity boo magic wand and you could just like make it hot, make it amazing, make it inclusive, what would it look like?
I think we'd be starting from a much younger age with the consent and the pleasure and the don't yuck my yum, right? Like if we had a version of that for kindergartners, that could be very helpful. Permission, I always just keep coming back to permission to have these conversations, permission. There was a young transitional age youth who stopped me during the middle of a lecture, and she said, "Do you mean I can say no even if I'm the one that initiated it?" And so by not giving her the information, she's still learning, she's still going, she's still doing the things, but by giving her the information, she can make a much more empowered decision with her life. And I know that just that one little piece of information has and will change her life moving forward from the conversation we had. And so we need to trust them. They're going to turn into adults. I have a slide I often show with the parents. Here's what you don't want. You don't want them to have an unintended pregnancy. You don't want them to get sexually assaulted. You don't want them to harm another person. All of those are very valid. And on the other slide is, what do you want? Do you want them to be able to negotiate healthy relationships? Do you want them to be able to say a little to the left, a little softer, a little more? Do you want them to be able to say stop? Like, all of those things are so important. Let's stop parenting for what we don't want our children to have and start parenting for what we do want them to have.
You make me wish Twitter was still around, because I would tweet like 90% of you have dropped gems tonight. You know, I think one of the things I'm writing a book about disabled motherhood in this moment. And one of the things that I said that came out in an interview I did with somebody else at one point was non-disabled parents don't want their disabled children to see disability as more than a diagnosis and as a culture. because it acknowledges the fact that there will always be part of their child's experience that they will not be the expert in. That they will not be able, like that there will be things that they do not know about their child, but that other people that they don't know will understand about their child. As a disabled, like, and I actually love the fact that like all the winners of the Carrie Buck Award have all been disabled mamas, which it just sort of struck me tonight. We should have our own club with like secret handshakes and like tactile decoder rings. As a disabled mom of a kid with a disability, what's the secret knowledge that you hold?
I think the fact that he understands ableism from a very young age, before his own diagnoses, before his own journey really started, he would be walking down the street and he'd say, "Oh, Mom, your friend Corbett couldn't come down this street." And I'd say, "Why?" And he says, "There's a lamppost in the middle of the way." Just little things like that that showed that that he was getting it. And then as he grew older and ableism became the lexicon in our family, he did receive his own diagnosis, and it came with some pretty ableist assumptions about what his life was going to look like. And I think he was 12 at the time, and he walked out of that doctor's office and he said, "Well, that doctor was ableist." And I knew that I knew the journey we were on was completely different from many parents who received that diagnosis with their child, because he already had the language of ableism. He already understood. His mold didn't look like mine, but it was a similar journey. And so I think people often think, oh, that's something for your graduate students or PhD. That's something we talk about in academia. It's not. It's something I think children should understand and learn. And it goes hand in hand with the consent piece for me.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn this back over to Mary. Give you another round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. It was a wonderful conversation, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if anybody in the audience has questions, if not, we have a couple from online. But I see one hand in the back, so we'll get started with that.
You are amazing.
Good evening, folks. I'm Innocent speaking. I am a graduate student here at Brandeis. I'm doing a global health policy and management. So I wanted to direct my question to Rebecca. You mentioned something about staying safe and informed. And where I was working in a refugee camp in East Africa, there is a case that I met once. It's a young lady, maybe late in her teens, and she had some mental illnesses. And one time she was put it on family planning methods without her knowing. And I wanted to know like how to balance between the intent of balancing between staying informed or having a consent, but with also the fact that his body autonomy being also mattering and protecting from those sexual abuse, because it's possible and the numbers are rising in Africa because of population and unwanted pregnancies. And some of my people where I come from, they don't even care much more about consent. It's something not big enough. I think we would talk about that question. Thank you so much.
Well, I think part of it is, as Laura said, is like actively having the conversation around consent in all the ways that it would show up in that type of situation. I think it's also an opportunity to build communities of peer support for that individual. of, I remember we were supporting I'm trying to remember what the project was. It was a project on, oh, it was a project on knowing your rights for people with mental illness. And all the trainers were people that did not have mental illness. And I remember them like wanting, like passing this proposal to me and being like, this is so great. And I was like, why are none of your trainers people living with mental illness? Well, people with mental illness can't train other people with mental illness. And it was like, okay, let's unpack our assumptions here, and I think given the circumstances that you're talking about, there is a conversation around culture and stigma that also, frankly, we here in the West like to tell folks in other countries what we think they should do and how we think they should do it, instead of empowering them with the resources and the tools to support them figuring out what works in their community. Because what works here is not going to work. Like what works here at Brandeis is not going to work in East Texas. It's not going to work in Colombia. It's not going to work in Egypt. But centering the community that's impacted and figuring out what does it look like to resource that community to figure out what works for them. I mean, I think it's really easy for us in the West to say nothing about us without us, and not acknowledge the fact that those words came from disabled activists working to overturn apartheid in South Africa. That's where it comes from. Not here. You didn't know that, Rob? Taught you something today. There, bonus point for me. It came from disabled activists in South Africa working to overturn apartheid. And yet it's been colonized by every movement possible. And so what does it look like to provide, and I think about this from a philanthropy perspective, which is like, what does it look like to actually provide resources to the community for the community to figure out what's the best way to approach? But I do think that's a very complicated issue.
Thank
Maddie,
you
have
so
another
much.
question?
Yeah, definitely. We have one from online. I'm going to combine a couple. What are some resources to learn more about this topic, for resources for parents, but also maybe for young people that want support to learn about what positive dating and relationships look like?
Do you want to jump in with that? Do you have any thoughts off the top of your head?
First place off the top of my head is the Consent Academy. They have classes across the gamut around consent. Consent for people with disabilities. My favorite class that they have is a series of classes there called Consent for Leadership. And they really help people sort of create the structures, the policies, the environment of consent. And I really appreciate that. They have lots of classes there. Yeah, Consent Academy is the first one that comes to my mind.
I think the Center for Parenting with a Disability that's housed here is pretty amazing and works with an amazing group of folks talking about these issues. I think there's a lot of really great work that's been developed by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, particularly through organizations like People First. And, I don't know if it still exists anymore, but there was a group called Kids as Self-Advocates for a long time that had developed curriculum to talk about dating and sexuality with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I do think there always needs to be more materials and resources. And so, I think those are just some that I can think of off the top of my head, but there's also some really great books. There's a great book out called, it's older now, like all my books are old because I'm old. The Ultimate Guide to Sex and Disability was one I was thinking about. There's one called We're Doing It, and it's people with intellectual disabilities and sex. I left that one on the coffee table. The kids had questions. It was awesome. But I think I would encourage to really look at material developed by disabled folks versus materials developed by people without disabilities.
Hi, thank you for your talk and responses so far. My name is Carolyn. I have a question kind of going back to parenting with disabilities. I was wondering if you would be willing and are able to provide kind of your experiences, if you had any fears becoming a parent because of disabilities and or limitations. As someone with multiple chronic illnesses and autoimmune conditions, I would love to become a mother, but I do look inward and wonder if I could do a great job given the limitations I would inevitably experience. And I think that's like a very hard conversation to have, not only with yourself, but with others. Thank you.
Do you want to go first? Sure. I think that for me, one of the biggest fears as a blind parent was losing him, or what happened in an emergency, and not being equipped or fast enough or knowing how to deal with that. And funny enough, it goes into the whole consent conversation and stranger danger. I didn't teach my son stranger danger. I taught him to approach strangers that he felt comfortable approaching. And so we would talk about what those strangers might be, as opposed to a stranger approaching him to see if he needs help. We would play out some of these scenarios. And so from a very young age, we had the plan. I did lose him once, and he had acted the plan perfectly, and everything went great. It really wasn't until I found community that I realized how much the first 9 years of my life parenting my child would have been so much easier if I had had other blind people to talk to about that. Community. And it just answers so many questions. How do you do this? How do you do that? When I learned that I could put a rubber band around my shampoo and know that that's my shampoo, it changed my life.
Something like that happens.
Took me 9 years to find blind people to tell me that, but yeah.
I think about, first off, I think the fear of losing a child is a fear that is universal across disabled and non-disabled parents. You know, and my husband has a vision disability. And I remember, of all places that our son decided to ditch him, it was at a Little People convention. And so he just blended in the crowd and like took off and went down an escalator and ended up being found by Warwick Davis, who's a bit of a celebrity in the Little People space. And like Warwick, my husband's like freaking out. I see him and I'm like, what's wrong? Because my husband also, he's average height. So he stands out at a Little People convention. And I walk over and I'm like, what's wrong, Patrick? And he's like, I lost Jackson. And I was like, all right, let's be cool. Let's, you know, and then up the escalator comes Willow Ufgood holding my child's hand. And also my husband was a super nerd. And so he like totally flipped out about the fact that Warwick Davis had rescued our child. You know, but I think it's one of those things that like you do the things that, you know, as you said, teaching your kid to figure out what strangers do you approach. You know, I remember a mom friend of mine, Carmen Jones, who uses a wheelchair, who told me that she was like, I kept my kids in overalls for years. And I was like, why? And she's like, because it gives you a ready handle that you can just snatch them up. And I was like, oh, that's genius. I never thought about like, you know, and when I worked retail, I used to tease the stock guys I worked with because that was when cargo jeans were in and they'd have like the big carpenter loop. And I used to say that those were dwarf handles. So if I needed them to do something, I would like grab them by the dwarf handle and be like, I need you to move this mannequin. I need you to grab those bras. But I do think that's the power of community. Let me tell you, for every limitation, you will figure out a way to adapt. And that is a universal thing of like parenting in general. You know, I believe in people having the ability to make the right choice for them at any point in time. But I also want you to know that there is a whole bunch of us mamas out here with a whole bunch of different types of disabilities that are more than willing to be part of your circle and help you figure it out when you want to figure it out. And there's still going to be things that you suck at. That's a universal thing in parenting. You're still going to have bad parenting days. But it makes it a lot easier when like I can pick up the phone and call Heather up here and be like, I love my child. I love my child. I love my child. Remind me that I love my child. Because he's 15 and he's 15. And Robin's like, sis, I got you. Like right there with you. you know, and like having that is the best tool in your toolbox. Followed by having a really good OBGYN that's not ableist and will support you.
Good evening. My name is Evelyn Maziku. I'm a student from Global Health Policy and Management. Thank you, team and the coordinators for this session. I'm from Tanzania, and I was a coordinator of adolescent sexual reproductive health. So I don't have a question, just to complement what Rebecca, you have been explained. It's true that sometimes we do forget these people with a disability, that they have also right for sexual reproductive health. We've been deciding for them while it's not. I can give example, sometimes even the healthy workers, when the disabled adolescent or person went there and ask maybe for condom or family planning, any method, they may respond, don't you see you the way you are? Huh? You don't feel sorry for yourself? So that is not right. They are human beings. They are disabled, but in reproductive system, it's not disabled. And to break this ice, it's not only for the disabled adolescent or youth, but for all parents. We need to break ice with our adolescent and youth. Sometimes we don't have time, we are afraid. I can give example, even myself. I have a youth. One day I went to visit a factory, they gave us condom, first class condom. Then my fellow team were men, they said, oh, we are going to use this condom. They were happy. But for me, I said, who should I give the condom? Then I said, can I give to my son? Then I asked him, how is he going to see mama gave me condom? So now he's allowing me to do whatever I can do. Then I said, oh, I started, hello, Brian, give me the status of HIV in your university. Mama, people are misbehaving there. People, they're changing girlfriends. I said, oh, so what should I do then? Then I got the idea. I told him, another day I told him, you remember that day you told me that in your university there is a lot of misbehaving people, they are exchanging girlfriend, boyfriends. I have this condom, 2 boxes. Can you please share with that friends? I know he will go and use himself, but that was my trick to help him. So that is the gap. It's not me, it's for every parent. We need to break the ice, share with our children how to give them information. People, they need to get information so that they make a choice, the decision. We should not decide for disabled people. They have rights. We need to support them. Thank you.
Well, and I think I wanted to add on to that because you talked about, you didn't use the framework, the framing of freedom to fail, but the language,
Dignity of risk.
the dignity of risk. Several years, like 20 years ago now, I was hosting a youth leadership conference in DC, and where we had young people with disabilities from all over the US come and stay at a hotel. And anytime you take a minority culture and you make them the majority within a geographically located space, shenanigans happen. And I remember I was the person on call that night, and I remember getting a call at 2:00 in the morning from the front desk, and they said 911 has been called on one of your young people. And I was like, okay, what room? And they tell me the room, and it's like the second night of the conference. And so like I got my pajamas on, I wake up my roommate, who's like the secretary of the organization. I was like, all right, MJ, we got to go downstairs, let's go find out what's going on. We're in the elevator and we're flipping through the binder, we're like, whose room is that? Whose room is that? Okay, it's Darcy's room. Okay, what's Darcy's disability? Darcy's deaf. Okay. Is Darcy on any meds or anything? No, not that's listed here in the information, right? So ding, the elevator doors open. We walk out, the hotel manager is there. The elevator doors ring again. It's the EMTs. They come with the stretcher and they're running to the room. The door is open. We walk into the doorway and it's Darcy's room. Darcy's sitting on the bed, chilling. The EMTs are not working on Darcy, they're working on a young man who's on the floor. And we're like, wait, we thought, okay, wait, who is that? And it's like second day of the conference, so you're still trying to figure out who everybody is. We're like, who is that? Who is that? Okay, that's Bobby. All right, what's Bobby's disability? Bobby has epilepsy. Darcy and Bobby, consenting adults, decided to hang out after hours. Darcy is deaf. Bobby has epilepsy. Darcy's hotel room is a deaf accessible hotel room. Bobby's seizures are impacted by photosensitivity. They decided to order room service, being all romantical. Room service showed up to deliver champagne to Bobby and Darcy's room and rang the doorbell, and in a deaf accessible hotel room, that means the lights flash. Their booty call gave Bobby a seizure. And so we had to have a very real conversation after Bobby got back from the hospital. We had to have an even more real conversation with Bobby and Darcy's parents. And then the next morning, we had to have a conversation with the group of 100 plus young people with disabilities. We're like, look, if there is anywhere in the country that it is safe for you to disclose your disability, it is this space. And just as we talk about the need for accessibility, there are also access conflicts. And if you are engaging in intimate activity with a partner at this conference, given the type of folks we have here, you may want to have a conversation about, are there access conflicts that you've never had to run into before in your small hometown where you've never dated, or you've never been in a relationship, or you've just never hooked up and had sex with somebody? And that's really real. And I think so many times we don't have those conversations. But now I want you all thinking about Darcy and Bobby. And that's how I learned, the other name for the story is how Rebecca learned that the sign for booty call in DC is an index finger tapping the left palm twice and then putting your fingers up to your ear like a phone. And so that's how I learned the ASL sign for booty call.
I have one last question that we're going to wrap up with.
Yes.
This is a question from one of our Zoom participants, and I'd like to direct it to Laura. Laura, I think your unique experience growing up, you may have something to add to this. Recognizing that disabled people come to the table with many different identities on top of being disabled, and religiosity is one of those identities. How do we teach consent to people of various religious identities?
I think that's a very good question. And I do go back to the question that I posed to parents. What is it that they do want for their children? Obviously, when you're working with folks with different religion, you're talking about them with their values, all of that. I often end up at the conversation where they are more the transitional age and they are trying to figure out for themselves what their values are. And I think it's really important that we do give permission for folks to explore and all of that. And yeah, intersectionality is, I'm not sure where to go with this. I mostly work with the transitional age youth who are figuring out for themselves what their values are.
Well, I think that's also where, finding allies and mentors even within those communities. Finding people who belong to that faith and may not have the same disability, but may have a different type of disability that can sort of serve as like a cultural broker or a cultural doula in the space to help create a space to at least start having that conversation, I think is really important. But I do think that, I think one of the opportunities and the challenges with the idea of seeing the whole person is understanding all the baggage that comes with being the whole person. And what are, it's never as easy as, like, I remember somebody saying to me, oh, I do intersectionality, I'm a disabled person. And I'm like, that's actually not what that means. And that's a whole nother conversation. And stop putting yourself out there as a speaker in this area. But like, what does it actually mean to sit and hold the tensions in that space? And I think it's one of those things that we have to continue to unpack and figure out how we talk about. you know, as it relates to the nexus of like your faith communities, disability, sex and sexuality. It's messy, but it's all messy. That's the joy of doing disability work. We are so delightfully messy, and we own that.
There's a, I'm not sure if it's,
Say it.
I think it's Church of Religious Science. They have a sex education curriculum out. Is that the correct church? I should have the correct name. They just had a 3-part series on disability justice and faith and how to incorporate disability justice into faith. And I think that's part of the whole being. I think that often faith can turn us into the pure blind person or the innocent
Or the
blind
miracle.
person.
Oh, look,
yes.
she walks.
The miracle or all of that. And I think disability justice really has a lot to teach different faiths about intersectionality, about the wholeness of people.
Thank you.
Thank you on that note. So please join me in thanking Laura and Rebecca. Really for this wonderful, for this thoughtful and really thought-provoking conversation. And Laura, I really appreciate the reminder that consent is part of and should shape our everyday interactions and from cradle to grave. So this is something I will really take from this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have, before we break for, we have a reception, so please stay back. We have a small plaque with, for Laura, with a picture of Carrie Buck. And hold on, I need to take off my glasses. It says, Laura Miller, Carrie Buck Distinguished Fellowship, awarded for her efforts to draw national attention to systemic ableism in reproductive health policy with today's date.
Thank you.
And an additional token for both Laura and Rebecca. It's a book by our very own Alex Green. We're not worthy. And the title goes to Rebecca, your ending message on Everything is Messy. It's A Perfect Turmoil. Walter Fernald and the Struggle to Care for America's Disabled. And I think a reminder about the complicated and the unfortunate legacy of institutionalization and reproductive justice. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well done.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Sorry.
This is the book.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. Thank you.